Good afternoon. Hi. I hope folks are able to stick around to hear from a panel that I think does a remarkable job, present company here excluded, from traversing the research to policymaker to practitioner spectrum around the really critical design issues that we were hearing about in the last panel. So I'm just gonna get right into it and just say who I'm sitting up here with and what their titles are, but then I'll get them to say a little bit about themselves. So to my immediate left is Marge Turner. She's the Senior Vice President for Program Planning and Management at the Urban Institute here in Washington. Fulton Meacham next to Marge. She's the President and CEO of the Charlotte, North Carolina Housing Authority. And then to my far left, Sarah Oppenheimer. She's the Director of Research and Evaluation for the King County, Washington Housing Authority. So I think everybody's full bios are in your packets, but I might just like to ask each of my fellow panelists to just say something about yourselves briefly, like if folks are reading your bio, like what might they not discover about you that relates to today's discussion on MTO, capital MTO, lowercase MTO, and assisted housing mobility more generally. Marge?
Sure. So I think my bio is clear. I have been a policy researcher for most of my career, from almost all of it at the Urban Institute. And the focus of my work has been on housing discrimination, housing segregation, why it matters, and what we ought to be doing about it. In the 90s, I was a political appointee at HUD and helped design and launch the capital M, capital T, capital O demonstration, which was an incredible honor to be able to do.
Yeah, Pat kind of gave that away on the last panel. Fulton?
Fulton Meacham, CEO of the Charlotte Housing Authority. What you may not know is I've actually been the CEO of Pittsburgh too. Both of these agencies are MTW agencies, moving to work agencies, which allows a great deal of flexibility and creativity. Focus has always been on how to move people in, up, and out of poverty. Concentrate a lot in supportive services and wraparound services for our residents to find pathways out of poverty.
Great. And Sarah?
So is that working? Okay. Sarah Oppenheimer. Yeah, so I actually was a relative newcomer to housing authority work. Oftentimes I think people come to housing authorities and there's such rich information to know. So I had a lot of catch up to do, and I came there about 6 years ago. KCHA is also an MTW housing authority, which means there's a lot of exciting innovation. And so I have this very cool job of being able to evaluate that and figure out who are very smart, cool researchers that we can do applied research with. And so one of the first projects I began working on when I came to the Housing Authority was starting to build out what our applied research agenda would look like related to mobility, as well as our place-based efforts. And just want to say, I feel so grateful that there is a practice panel up here. It's really exciting. There were many moments throughout the day where I'm like, oh, I think it would be great to say something on it. And I was so reassured that our research colleagues, they had all, because we've been collaborating so closely, they were able to answer a lot of those practice-based questions, which was fantastic, and it's exciting to see it come full circle in this panel.
Actually, as a moderator, I thought maybe I should just, like, at 55 minutes, open it up to Fulton and Sarah and just say, feel free to respond to all of the questions that arose for you guys in the first couple hours of the event. But I'll try to be a little bit more structured about it. So maybe I can start with you, Marge, and ask you, as a housing researcher, a former policymaker, and just like an extraordinary human being, how do you think about and describe the kind of the wider context for the discussion around the new findings around capital M, capital T, capital O, capital C, capital M, capital T, capital O, which, again, I think the last panel began to allude to, but I think you're a great authority on this, too.
Thanks, Alan. I do want to build on the themes Pat started to raise in the last panel and really broaden this conversation out so it encompasses the larger context of racial segregation and injustice within which assisted housing mobility policies really need to be considered. So I'm going to say, perhaps even more bluntly than Pat did, that we, the United States, systematically and intentionally built separate and unequal neighborhoods. We did it through public policies. We did it through individual action. We did it through institutional practices. We excluded people of color from the neighborhoods that offered amenities and opportunities. And we starved the neighborhoods in which people of color were concentrated, trapped, consigned to live, of public and private resources and investments. And the consequences over decades have been profound for the long-term economic prospects of children growing up in those neighborhoods, for people's physical and mental health, but not just for individuals. It's for the persistence of racial prejudice and polarization in our country, and the persistence of fear among us on all sides of the line. So we know that history of racial segregation produced poverty concentration. And in more recent years, we've been seeing an increase in economic segregation. And a lot of the conversation in the first panel sort of seemed to be talking about economic segregation as if it didn't have anything to do with this history of racial segregation. And I don't want to suggest that the two are just the same thing, but you really can't think about them independently. I don't think we would have poverty concentration and neighborhood distress if we had not intentionally and systematically and effectively built separate and unequal neighborhoods. So we've been talking today mostly about the promise and potential of assisted housing mobility programs, who benefits and at what cost, and what it takes to make them effective. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. I really believe that these programs play an important role. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career figuring out what role they can play and also how we can advance them. So I think they're incredibly important for the participating families, but not just for the participating families, for helping us break down the patterns of racial segregation and poverty concentration that we so effectively built. But we can't think that assisted housing mobility programs, no matter how we scaled them, can do it by themselves. We really have to think of them as one tool in a broader toolkit that advances interconnected, not competing strategies of restoring the well-being and access to opportunity in historically distressed neighborhoods. And I tend to agree that it starts with safety, safety from the police as well as from criminals. But I agree with Pat, that's necessary but not sufficient. I think we need to think about how to preserve affordable housing in neighborhoods that are changing, even if they're not opportunity rich right away. If they appear to be becoming opportunity rich, we have to make sure that we're preserving the affordable housing options that are there. And we need to expand access to opportunity rich neighborhoods for people living in distressed communities. And again, that's more than a mobility program. We tend to focus so much on the behavior of the low-income people, their preferences, their choices, their failures in moving to the kind of neighborhood we think they should live in. We need to focus at least as much attention on the behaviors, the exclusionary policies, and the exclusionary practices of the people who live in opportunity-rich neighborhoods, and that is most of us. So I'll stop there, but I welcomed the Let's Stop Being So Polite invitation and felt like we ought to be explicit.
Good, let's get nasty. No, I'm joking. So for folks who haven't spent a ton of time in Charlotte or in Seattle, King County, I just wanted to ask Fulton and Sarah to say a little bit about sort of what your communities look like from the standpoint of the clients you serve and how much they do or don't resemble the sort of separate and unequal landscape that Marge was describing characterizes a lot of metropolitan America.
Charlotte, southern city, population somewhere 800,000, and we have this crescent of poverty, right? So you have north, south, east, and west. The crescent really is from east to west. High opportunity areas are predominantly south and north. East and west part of the community is predominantly African American. The housing developments in which we manage, again, high concentrations of poverty there as well. Luckily, we've been able to get 5 Hope Sixes, which really put us in a position to really transition some of our communities and make them more mixed income type communities. And so in doing that, we've been able to, in some cases, be able to make those families, those communities, if you will, higher opportunity areas by bringing in high wealth, high income individuals to those particular communities. But at the same time, schools hadn't always caught up with that. And so in some cases, in some of my communities, you could probably draw a Section 8 around low-performing schools and high poverty areas. No pun intended, but I think there's a little pun intended. And so what we're trying to do now is look at ways through our own mobility program, our housing opportunity program, is to really go out here and communicate with owners and see how we can actually get more of the market when it comes to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We have things like, there was a question earlier about, we have income source discrimination that's legal in Charlotte. We do not have inclusionary zoning in Charlotte. So we have some structural issues that we have to overcome in order to get our families into these areas. And so we've hired some individuals to kind of help them search, go out and actually communicate with these landlords and let them know that we have some fantastic participants that just need a little more opportunity. We've been able to also increase our payment standards, so now we can actually get into some of the areas that we couldn't get before, right? We couldn't get into some of the southern parts of our city because the prices were too high, and the fair market rents that HUD was giving us didn't allow our residents to be able to move there. Now we're able to go up to 150% of the area median income on these particular units, and so now we're able to get more of our families there. So Charlotte is different than Seattle in a lot of different ways, but we're happy because we're almost ready to get into the Opportunity Insights and start working with them on exactly how we can scale the program that we already have.
Great. I'm going to come back and ask you more about that, Fulton. So let's hear a little bit about Seattle, King County.
All right. So Seattle and King County is different than Charlotte, and so I think it's good to sort of be hearing about this work in different communities throughout the country. I'm pleased to see that Nathan put up maps so you guys have a sense of the geography of King County and Seattle. King County is the jurisdiction that the King County Housing Authority serves, and then in the center of it, there's the Seattle Housing Authority, and the Seattle Housing Authority covers that jurisdiction. So we've made it very complicated for voucher holders at the outset. King County is a really huge geography. It's about the size of Delaware. 1.3 million people live in King County outside of Seattle, and I think about 750,000 people live in Seattle proper. It's also very, very fragmented in terms of municipalities. So if we are thinking about structural issues, if we're thinking about local policies and the impact of local politics, that is something that is very much alive and well in King County. There's 38 different municipalities. KCAJ also covers unincorporated King County. So we cover 19 different school districts. It's just very much of a patchwork. But on the plus side, it's one housing authority. And so I think because we have this sort of regional scope, when we have looked at our neighborhood, certainly with the opportunity outlets, but when we've looked at our community even before that, we've seen the variability and, you know, where we have such variability along economic lines, along poverty rate lines, along school quality, all these things, and that definitely shows up alive and true in the maps that Nathan was talking about too, and that has really been a motivator for us to think about the role that the Housing Authority should be playing in place and really thinking critically and more strategically around how we can work on deconcentration work. I think that from our family's perspective, it's important to point out, I don't think they even realize when they come in the geography that KCHA covers, and we can talk about that more later maybe in terms of how that plays in to the work that the navigators are doing with families around opportunity area education. But the other, I think, important backdrop that certainly our families are feeling and that is alive and well, is that we've seen enormous economic growth in Seattle and King County, that has been fueled by the tech industry, and that has been great for many. It has not benefited our families, for sure. That has primarily benefited people who are much higher income, I would say moderate to high income, but primarily high, right? And so we are seeing a tremendous bifurcation of wealth in our community. Our families have certainly not benefited from that, but they have felt the impacts because the economic growth has made huge impacts on our housing market. And so, vacancy rates are incredibly tight. Less than 1% in most areas. So the competition for units is just staggering. I was looking at some data with my team last week, and I was like, this can't be right, that year upon year, this one community has had 0% vacancy, and it has. So there is a need for affordable housing, for sure. We've also seen that rents have continued to increase. For a one-bedroom unit, the median rent is now $2,000 in King County, and we're talking about needing units that are much larger than that for our families. And so families are being pushed into different communities, and they don't necessarily feel like they have a lot of choice in the matter or that they necessarily have the tools. And I think that's what we're hearing when families come in the door around how the broader sort of economic backdrop is impacting them.
Can I just briefly ask each of you, how much do you see the neighborhoods in which your families live, be they in place-based subsidized housing or voucher holders, suffering from high rates of violent crime? Back to the discussion from earlier with Pat and the long-term effects of that.
I would say it's pretty much the same throughout the city. I don't think it's disproportionately more. But I do think it is disproportionately more in the media. It's disproportionately more in the papers. You hear about it more. People see that more than you see it on the other side of town, which I do believe puts a situation where you see these communities as they're the problem, and the people in them are the problem as well.
Yeah, I think one thing about Seattle and King County is that, fortunately, I don't think that we have experienced the same level of violent crime as other places in the country. I think that, safety and considerations of safety are factoring into our families' decisions may look quite different than the kind of conversations that Stephanie and others have had with folks in Baltimore and other places in the country where there are much higher rates of violence and frankly, a greater proportion of really concentrated poverty than we see in Seattle and King County. That said, and Stephanie would be able to speak to this more, I do think safety is showing up in some conversations with families. I think that is sort of a constant. And I also think that, similar to what Felton was saying, I think where we see violent crime coming up, I think it often is connected to families in subsidized housing, which is incorrect, but that is the narrative that is shaped.
Yeah, so there's a reality and there's a perception, I think each of you are alluding to there. So let's dig in a little bit on CMTO and assisted housing mobility for a few minutes. So maybe start with you, Marge, and ask you, given your storied history in researching discrimination, barriers to housing mobility, capital M, capital T, capital O. Like when you saw the findings from the research that Nathan presented, did you say, "Oh my God, that's blowing my mind," or did you say, "Of course, I've always known that," or something in between, or a little more nuanced?
So I thought it was really great, really heartening to see that well-designed, well-delivered, hands-on help tailored to the needs of families really makes a difference to what they can do. I was really interested and I think pleased that, in fact, you don't need to restrict the target location of the voucher. You give real help and extra help getting over those hurdles but people can move wherever they want to move, where they think is best for their family. So I think that's really exciting to see those in such a rigorous research design. And I think it points to tools we can build in and should build in to the housing voucher program more fully. But people have also talked about source of income discrimination. And a couple of years ago, Urban did a structured testing study in 5 sites of the ability to use your voucher. And it shows how important it is to get more landlords accepting voucher holders, especially in high opportunity neighborhoods. As a research team, we sifted through more than 341,000 rental ads in those 5 study sites in order to get about 8,700 units that were available and met local voucher standards. So we were essentially on a large scale doing what families have to do to even identify a unit they could call and ask, do you accept vouchers? And when they made that call, the answer was no 78% of the time in Fort Worth, 76% of the time in LA, 67% of the time in Philadelphia, lower in Newark, 31%, and lower in DC, which does have source of income protection, 15%. So we didn't have enough sites to be able to say with rigor that source of income protections do it, but I think there's a good argument for pushing on that tool if you can enforce it, because you don't have to just put the protections in place, you have to enforce them. One other interesting thing I just want to put on the table is, we've already talked about the fact that the voucher program is too small to meet needs. It's not 1 in 4, it's 1 in 5 eligible households gets assistance nationwide. But several of the presidential candidates have been talking about a renter tax credit in various flavors. Some of those flavors look an awful lot like a housing voucher delivered through your tax returns rather than by a housing authority. And I think there's a lot of really interesting questions there about whether it'll work better because there's less stigma, less concern about the housing authority bureaucracy, or whether it will work worse because there is no housing authority to support you, and there is certainly no housing counseling to support you. So I think that's a really interesting area for us to be pushing on, whether we get a renter tax credit or not.
Right. Well, I'm in between 2 researchers, so I'm going to take it from the point of a CEO and dealing with this mobility question. It forced us to really deal with what you just talked about, is all the bureaucracy that comes with managing this voucher program. The inspection process, timeliness of inspections, really being introspective about when you can actually pay. So we have to make this program more market-like, and that's what we've had to really have this, internal discussion with ourselves. How do you make the program more market-like? When you go look for an apartment, you go to an apartment, you do a criminal background check, credit check. If everything works out, then you ultimately go there, sign off on your deposit, pay your deposit, move in, right? With us, it takes a little longer than that, right? Sometimes 45 days, 60 days. And so we've had to talk with, and we created a landlord group that comes and talks, as an advisory group, that comes and talks about those issues. And that's what we can't do, is be afraid of hearing the truth from them and being able to make those changes. So we've been able to reduce now those times for inspections down to 7 days. We're trying to we're still working on our being able to pay at the same time a person moves in. But I think what it's doing now is allowing us more opportunities in the community to actually find housing for our participants, right? Because that's what this is at the end of the day, where they want to live, right? Definitely in the areas of opportunities, but where they want to live. And that's what this mobility program is kind of doing for us. being very introspective about it and how we can actually grow more of this market.
Yeah, Sarah, so I'm glad we're sort of talking about some of the details of implementation, and I wonder, like, as you look at just, if you were just looking at Nathan's presentation about CMTO, you sort of know the main elements of the search assistance program, the landlord engagement. But sort of what about KCHA and, you know, what you all went through in order to partner effectively around the demonstration might you not glean if you were just looking at reading the research paper? Like, what were the particularities, you know, for your agency at that point in time for making this thing a reality and getting the results that you did?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think part of the motivation, but also one of the challenges we assumed at the outset was that we were launching this during such an expensive and tight time in the rental market. I think that sort of, you know, up the ante for KCHA and SHA, because I think we had this notion, if we can make this work here, then that will really be, you know, something else for us, right? And it also will be, I think, useful for understanding what are some of the elements of these services that might translate to housing authorities that are working in similarly tight rental markets. I think, you know, we've talked a lot about sort of the program design, and, you know, I'm so incredibly pleased and proud of it. And I think part of that is because we put a lot of time at the outset talking with families, talking with landlords, talking with our frontline staff who know the ins and outs of the barriers of why families are not leasing up quickly or leasing up at all, and spent months also working with our colleagues in Baltimore and Dallas and Chicago, learning about their programs, learning about which elements of those programs might translate well in Seattle and King County, and what places we may need to do some tailoring because of specific, you know, experiences in the market, and also with an eye towards how could we build out something that we thought would be as scalable and as efficient as possible. Because as this was something that we were launching in-house at the Housing Authority with our CBO partner, we wanted to only test things that we thought weren't just pie in the sky, but would be things that if they were effective, we could probably take to scale eventually. So, you know, part of those conversations led to a lot of the insights that Fulton's talking about. You know, we learned from landlords that it was our own bureaucracy that was often standing in the way of people getting their foot in the door. And so what were some efficiencies we could build in? And so Nathan talked about landlord outreach and engagement, but partly that was us doing a lot of deep thinking on our end around, like, how could we streamline pretty bureaucratic processes around the filing of new housing paperwork, around our inspection schedules, around how we actually get our rent checks processed, to have, you know, 1 to 3 day turnaround times, because that's what it was going to take to convince landlords in these hot markets that it was worth renting to a Section 8 voucher holder when there was another person right in line who would pay the same amount. It also meant working really closely with families to find out what had their prior experience been within the housing search process. And, you know, it was heartbreaking when we would hear from families that, you know, they didn't even know that they had poor credit until they had applied to a unit, and that's when they found out that they had this credit score that was keeping them out of housing. Well, that shouldn't be when people find out that information, and that's something that we can change, right? So incorporating into the navigator services, running, you know, credit checks so that people are armed with that information, that's really powerful. And that's not a simple operational change, but it's something that we can absolutely do. I think another surprising thing that came out is that, you know, we kind of assumed, you know, this is what the housing search process looks like. You know, you go to apartments.com, you go to Craigslist, you find units. And I think one thing that I remember talking with Stephanie about is that, and wasn't surprising because if we really thought about our conversations with families over the years, you know, it's so expensive in Seattle and King County. Most people have not done a lot of sort of traditional housing search because they didn't have the resources until they had a voucher to go do that. So they've been staying with family and friends. They've been going through sort of lots of sort of non-traditional housing search processes. And then they get this voucher and we're like, okay, the clock's ticking, go find a place and go to apartments.com and you'll be fine. But that's an entirely new process. And so we need to set up how we build that information out with families and how we use that as a starting point. And I think the navigators do a tremendous job with that. But I also think that there was great insights along the way about how we can just do a better job of explaining the voucher program, explaining, like, what are the limits, explaining where can, you know, what can your voucher pay for and where are the areas you can be moving. And those kind of operational changes are things that we can, you know, use to the benefit of anybody who's coming through the door. And
yeah,
that's
actually
really
like, it seemed like a lot of things you were talking talking about are the positive externalities of having done a CMTO demonstration that spill over to families who aren't in CMTO proper.
And that was like, I think that was one of a big motivation for the housing authorities participating is like, I think this was an opportunity to say, one, how can we start to think about mobility and how we support families' geographic choice more critically? And two, how can we use this as an opportunity to look under the hood and make our voucher program that much better functioning?
So, notwithstanding that, I wanted to just stick sort of within the housing mobility space and sort of within the voucher space. I'm just sort of curious in both of your instances, Fulton and Sarah, how much you feel like you are, making a trade-off, right, between just like I can serve X number of families with the gold-plated services versus the silver-plated services, right, and how you, as an agency and without unlimited resources, should weigh your activities in both of those classes.
That is the philosophical question, wasn't it? When we first
You're at the Brookings Institution,
I know, right? When we first started, considering the program, that was the dilemma. We're in a city. I have 13,000 people on the waiting list. We need 34,000 new affordable housing units in the city of Charlotte right now. And everybody was saying, you just need to find housing now and go, right? Because I think everybody knows that HUD didn't give you additional money to do this, right? So you have new increased payment standards, but it takes maybe sometimes 1.5 of the amount of rent that you would pay in a standard unit than to move into a high opportunity area. So our board struggled with that for a little bit of moving people fast anywhere they would like to go to really having a concentrated focus on trying to move people into high opportunity areas. And so we looked at a pilot of 100 families moving there. And so it is, I don't look at it as a trade-off. Let's say it's not a trade-off. It really is something of how we build and get to scale. I think that's what we're talking about. How do we get to scale? How do we, in this process, because we are finding some efficiencies in our program, and we're honing in on some of the issues that landlords have, how do we just make it better now for all the residents, all the participants that we have, so that there really is more choice, right? Because if we have good relationships with these new housing providers, just simply because this person moves out, they'll let another person move in, right? And that's how we're kind of taking it is, this is our first foot in the door of selling the program in a place we've never been able to sell it before, opening up a market that we've never had before.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this trade-off, if we think of it that way, I mean, is something that we grapple with a ton, right? I mean, wait lists are long. Obviously, homelessness in Seattle and King County is a huge crisis. I think that, I think has taken us to task a lot over the last 5 years in thinking about how are we thinking about multi-tiered payment standards on our vouchers, and how are we thinking about our work in this space on mobility as well as our work on place-based. We had moved to multi-tiered payment standards before CMTO, and well before. We had been in a 2-tier system and then had moved to 5 and now 6. There are some efficiencies in that, and I think that helps us to not lead the market in some of the lower cost areas, and then to not lag the market in some of the more expensive areas.
Can you just say, Sarah, so like at a dollar difference across the tiers, we know the program is about $2,600 a client for the services. What is the incremental payment to get to the high opportunity neighborhoods for the voucher?
Okay.
Do you have any?
So I think that the difference between a 2-bedroom in 1 and 6, I want to say, is on the order of about $850. So it's quite a large span, right? But I think one of the reasons that we had gone to the multi-tiered standard is because it's not enough. It's not an equitable solution to be issuing a ton of vouchers that nobody can use. And it's not enough to issue a ton of vouchers that, as we've seen historically, can only be used in certain communities. And so we need to, the pendulum obviously can't swing so far that we're serving only a few number of folks. But I think that we've also taken a long game view on sort of the equity approach in this, that if we can really build in choice in an intentional way, which includes making sure that we're right-sizing the value of the voucher to these local markets are demanding, and doing regular analysis, like we reanalyze our payment standards twice a year now to make sure that they're keeping pace with the market. That's how rapidly it's changing. That's what we need to do to make sure that people who have gotten this resource can use it and that their families can benefit from it. And at the same time, making sure that we're spreading this resource as far as we can. So, we're keeping a really close eye, obviously, on these percentages of where folks are living by tier, and those are leading to real-time conversations.
Marge is a former HUD official and somebody who is in touch with a lot of housing authorities around the country and thinks about a lot of different markets. So from your perspective, I don't know, when you think about this question of scale and the scalability of an intervention like CMTO, and recognizing that we're probably next to some of the higher performing, higher capacity housing authorities in the country. So what comes to mind for you as ingredients for success in taking this up a level?
Well, so we're constrained as long as at the federal level we're not willing to expand the housing voucher program. So sometimes we have these terrible fights between people of goodwill because we're battling over insufficient resources. So I really liked both your answers. I mean, these are creative, effective housing authorities thinking proactively about how to make low-cost adjustments that make the program work better for everybody, but not allowing this precious resource of a housing subsidy to be used, to limit families to neighborhoods where the evidence shows it may not do the adults any harm anymore. We've already done it. But it certainly is doing the children harm, and we ought to stop doing that with our scarce housing subsidies.
So let me just shift the conversation just a little bit, just a few degrees, and come back to the topic of the sort of the economic outcomes for adults, which was the topic of the paper that Jens presented earlier. And on that note, let me start with you, Fulton, because I know this is a place where the Charlotte Housing Authority has had work requirements for its adult clients for some time now, and I wonder sort of what you've learned from that and how you see some of the findings from Jens's paper, given what you've learned there, and given some of the other experiments that we've conducted on helping to move public housing clients into work, like Jobs Plus, strategies like family self-sufficiency that were alluded to in his paper too.
We really do believe you have to be more than bricks and sticks as a housing authority. We have a supportive services program with a mandatory work requirement. There's a difference. Mandatory work requirement is just saying, hey, basically get up, go to work, right? Not a lot of supports, just a requirement for people to go to work. Ours is completely different than that. We have a supportive services program with case managers that work with our families, identify what barriers are, what they might be, child care, education, transportation. We pay for child care. And so we're wrapping services around the requirement of a mandatory work requirement. We've seen some great success with that model. We have roughly a 48% graduation rate of positive moves. Positive moves means individuals that move out of subsidized housing into market rate housing. And so we just believe that this is the right model, and we'd like to see that combined also with now the mobility component of, okay, so we didn't really have a lot of impact before on adults. Why? Sometimes maybe there wasn't the right compassion and consequence to go along with that in our model of the supportive services to go along with the mandatory work requirement. And we've had some great success. We have Jobs Plus as well. We have a Jobs Plus program in a community that started out at 20% employment, now is at 75% employment. So when we talk to residents, some of it is they didn't know these supports were available. We're finding out that marketing our programs, and that's marketing, not just the first thing that they heard when they're signing off on a lease, but I mean, full-fledged marketing this program to people and making sure that they know it's available to them in newsletters and Facebook and other things is the way to get them connected. And so we really do feel that there are really many opportunities to move the needle on the adults as well as the children.
And do you feel from that experience, or do you have a sense as to how much the neighborhood in which they're living or the part of the city in which they're living plays into their success in moving to work or not? Like do you really feel like this will overlap a lot with the mobility strategies, or are these two different things?
There's no question there's certain parts of the city that don't have as much, transportation, not as close to transportation, further from job centers that do impact it. But I do believe that we do have a transportation system in Charlotte. So the real issue is that in some cases the question for our families was never, have you thought about what you want to do? Right? You're 27 years old. Maybe you have not had a job. What would you like to do? What would you like to be? And then they tell you this, right? And then you put together with them a plan of action about how to do it and just watch them flourish, right? I mean, that's what it is. The intervention between case managers or that support team and the resident is where I think the real secret sauce is.
Sounds a lot.
That's where I think.
The navigator model we were just
Right.
I was just gonna say that.
Right.
I mean, I think the secret sauce is asking families as experts, what do you think, right? And so I think Stephanie articulated it well in terms of how navigators and CMTO are talking about this, but it relates back to, I think, one of the interesting findings or at least what I pulled in the discussion of Jens' paper around families who had been part of MTO and had been employed, and sort of the disruptive effect of moves potentially on currently employed families. And so obviously I read that paper after we have been working with navigators, but I think one of the interesting things that I think that is part of the navigator model is really thinking about what are the unique circumstances and contours around each family's life, and how does employment, childcare, transportation, social networks play into that. And if families are currently working, thinking about where's your work located, where do you take your kids, where do you drop them off? Well, let's think about how we would, the navigator is physically going out, driving different routes, going and looking at different maps or driving on the bus routes with folks to figure out how might this work in your life, given where you're working right now. And that means, to the conversation earlier about choice, that for some families, it's not going to make sense to move areas. And that's part of what I think makes CMTO successful, right? And so I don't think of the 54% who didn't move to high opportunity areas as not actually being successful in the intervention. I think maybe they ended up in where they are in their other community in a way that feels more informed and more intentional, and that's really exciting. So I am hopeful that will have some impact on the economic outcomes that we see for families. But I think that this is, the economics of the adults who are moving, it's a really heavy lift. We have FSS in our broader programs. We've moved to biennial inspections as a way to hopefully incentivize working. We have lots of partnerships with workforce development, and we do our own early learning programming as well as out-of-school time supports as a childcare resource for families. And that said, it's so expensive that the idea of moving into a living wage job and having consistent hours at a living wage salary is still really outside of the realm of possibility for a lot of our families.
Fulton, did you want to add to that? No, I wasn't sure.
Oh, no, I agree. We'll make this easy.
I like additions like that. All right, so Marge, as again, someone sort of present at the creation of MTO, and I've maybe read a third of the bajillion MTO papers that folks have published over the years. So I have a slight sense of what the preponderance of the evidence was saying up to the point of Jens's new contribution. So I wonder how you reacted to the findings of that, thinking about experimental versus non-experimental, and then again related to what I think these guys were just saying about the reality of work and the lives of folks who come into contact with public housing agencies and are coming from often very poor neighborhoods.
So I obviously, when the earliest MTO results found no employment and earnings effects, I was really disappointed by that, and I'm disappointed by this latest evidence that no matter how you slice and dice those MTO findings for adults, including testing some arguments I have made about why we didn't see the results we expected, that there still isn't a strong argument that the move alone results in better employment and earnings outcomes for adults. But I think Stephanie's point about the complexity of these families' lives, your point about what a huge climb it is to get to a real living wage job, given the disadvantages you've been dealt from the outset, and we may need to accept that for many families, a move alone isn't enough, and but that a move plus might be better than just the plus without the move. I think we still have a lot to learn on that. But I also want to come back to Stephanie's point about the health of the parents, health and mental health. So first of all, that is a really important outcome in and of itself, for people to be healthier and not depressed and not anxious. But in addition, I believe the evidence says that one of the worst things for a child's well-being is to have a parent with depression. So addressing parents' depression is a huge, important benefit for kids. So we still have to figure out how to help adults whose opportunities have been so profoundly constrained, how to help them not just be great parents for their kids and give their kids a better shot, but make some headway up the economic ladder themselves.
I want to ask a penultimate question before my last question. So I guess I just wanted to get to this question of race a little more explicitly and use Charlotte and Seattle, King County to illustrate. Thinking about the potential scale and the effects of mobility solutions. So just being real, Fulton, like how much is racism, going to be a barrier for folks moving from that crescent to the southern and more prosperous parts of your city, to their ability to make the move and to their success once they make that move?
Ask that question again.
How much do you feel like just plain old
messing with you?
Plain old racism.
Just messing with you.
I started shaking my boots when you said that.
No. Again, I started off the conversation saying we're in a southern city. Okay. I've talked to you about we don't have inclusionary zoning. We have pretty much income source discrimination. There's some things that are baked into the pie a little bit that I think as a city we are really grappling with. We've had some very difficult conversations, I think, over the last 4 years about race, about equity. But one thing I'm happy about is I think we're facing it now. We had a pretty big blow up that we had to look ourselves in the face and say race is an issue. We didn't know. Some of us in our community didn't know that there really was an affordable housing crisis, or that individuals that really are looking for employment can't find that employment in the city. In a city that's growing so fast, 100 people moving there a day, and buildings 40,000 apartments going up every day. The question was, what is in it for me? So will it be an issue? Yes, it will be. But I think the leadership that we have in the city now, I would say both on the business side as well as the public side, are really facing that issue and trying to address equity when it comes to affordable housing. And we've raised over $175 million right now to put more additional units on the ground to give people more opportunity. That's that supply that we're talking about, right? Of where some of the families in which we serve on a day-to-day basis now will be able to live, work, and play. But racism has and is a barrier in this whole affordable housing issue.
Sarah?
Yeah, so we're not a southern city, and racism still plays, I think, a huge role in Seattle, Lincoln County. Shocking. But in true Northwest fashion, it's much more passive ways, perhaps. And so, I think that while they were not statistically significant differences, when Nathan showed those bar charts, we are seeing fewer Black families move to high opportunity areas than white families. And I think racism plays into that. I think we have source of income discrimination now statewide in Washington. And I think that we are still seeing discrimination, just not in overt ways, and we need stronger enforcement. So I think that there is still lots of work to be done. I think one of the, I think two things on the more positive side. One is that I think the maps have been a really powerful tool in our work with families in the community to really think more empirically and, move away from sort of assumptions that I think oftentimes were driven by assumptions on race and income of what are high opportunity neighborhoods. And so we had done prior work on mobility counseling long before CMTO with different maps, and heard from a lot of families, like, you've picked a small number of very white communities and we're not interested in going there. And when we did the mapping with the atlas, I think that it was helpful to see which communities came up, and it's a more diverse map than we've had in the past. And I think that that was really helpful. It gained a lot of trust, I think, frankly, in the families that we're working with, that we were taking new approaches to really understand what it was about these communities. And I think the other thing is that you can't talk about mobility, which relates to concentration of poverty and segregation, without talking about race and the role that the housing authorities have played in perpetuating that and what we need to do about it. But I think we were pretty slow to get there, frankly, at KCHA. And so I think this has prompted some really thoughtful conversations and strategies throughout the agency that maybe were brought on by this mobility work, but I think have impacts like far above and beyond anything having to do with just CMTO.
Thank you, guys. Okay, so let me wrap up with a very sort of Brookings question. I think Jenny asked a version of this on her panel too, which is, where should the research and demonstration field be moving next? What should Nathan and his team at Opportunity Insights be doing next to really, help us better understand not only the potential effects of assisted housing policy on economic mobility, but like how to do it well? Because I sit in a think tank, but I've been told that implementation matters. So start with you, Marge.
So I want to come back to this secret sauce question that got raised a lot. And I agree that we need to understand better what aspects of a place make the biggest difference in terms of people's prospects. But I also want to suggest a tweak on this, that maybe the secret sauce is changing over time. I mean, the world is way different than it was in the decade when the kids we can see outcomes for were growing up. The internet wasn't the same kind of issue. The labor market was different. The housing market was different. I don't know what else is different because I grew up in the 1960s. So I think this is a real issue for me, that what what makes an opportunity-supporting neighborhood may be changing in some ways, and we better get smarter about it. And then I just want to put out one other plea for researchers and research institutions, and that is to face up to race and racism in our work. And doing the kind of community-engaged listening that Stephanie does is part of that, because if you really listen to people and treat them as people who have wisdom to help inform the research and the policy development, I think you're going to learn a lot about race and racism. But there are ways to think about statistical methods that acknowledge racism instead of just treating race as this characteristic you put in as a dummy variable. And I think a lot of us have gotten the answers to our questions wrong. We probably asked some wrong questions, and we've definitely gotten our policy prescriptions wrong. I know I have. So this is something that I am really thinking about a lot. The Urban Institute is thinking about. Brookings is thinking about. We all really got to work on this.
Thanks, Marge. Fulton?
First, I just want to say thank you for giving practitioners like myself real information that we can go help our families with. And I just want to say thank you. Because for far too long, we've been thinking these things, but not being able to really move the needle from a policy standpoint, boards and et cetera, because they said, well, that really doesn't make a difference in somebody's life, maybe moving them to a high quality community, right? A high opportunity community. So thank you for giving us that information so that we can now move forward. There's empirical evidence that says we should do this, and that gives us permission to do it. I might be struggling a little bit about what else we can do, but I mean, technology. I mean, how does that play a part now in moving our families, let's say, to high opportunity areas that can't move to high opportunity areas, right? How can we engage this internet, this new world, to put our residents in a better position? Because we will constantly, I do believe, face issues where a hard unit, a physical unit, may not be available. So I would think that we need to be thinking broader than that to figure out, are there other ways for us to kind of, I think as we asked that question earlier today, what happened to those communities that people left from? Maybe technology is a way that we can increase the value of those areas.
That's great. Sarah?
So I think it's been suggested a lot already. So, I mean, I think that the place-based work needs further evidence for the reasons that Fulton is describing. I think that it can really reinvigorate the policy and practice conversations. I think it will give us more precise tools. I think it will bring more folks to the table. So I think that's already been said, and I would wholeheartedly double down on all those suggestions. I think another place that would be helpful to get some additional inquiry is around and it's started up again. I think there's, on looking at displacement and gentrification and really what's happening across these neighborhoods. I think in Seattle and King County, displacement is front and center, something we're thinking about in both families who are living in high opportunity as well as families that are living in lower opportunity communities. And I think we don't have a great evidence base to help us answer our questions and sort of shape our approaches to that in critical ways. And then I think the last suggestion or hope I would have would be to actually piggyback on what Stephanie was saying about really understanding families' experiences of neighborhoods and how families are defining their neighborhoods. So, perhaps more in suburban communities like King County, but I think not dissimilar to lots of other places across the country, sort of how we have been describing neighborhoods is very much sort of an urban, an urban way of describing it that I don't necessarily think shows up well for a lot of the families we work with. Like, it was hard to even think about out a term to describe some of the neighborhoods on our maps because it's diffuse, right? And people have their own definition of what their neighborhood is, but it is based on sort of boundary lines that they have come up with. And so I would love to see some work around sort of revisiting how we're describing neighborhoods and neighborhoods across the country that doesn't necessarily just rely on census tracts or on sort of urban definitions of neighborhood. And so then the last thing I would just say is to, second the thanks to have, practitioners up here and to put a plug in for the conversations to continue to involve certainly families and the communities we're working with, as Marge said, but then also to continue to include housing authorities and other public institutions that are doing this work, who I think we haven't necessarily done a great job of bridging engagement with, but I think that we'll get much better findings that don't feel sort of black box if we continue these types of conversations.
That's great. Thanks to each of you. And yeah, and having done a little bit of field work in South King County over the years, right? Like the notion of like a neighborhood as represented by a census tract. I mean, come on. Right?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Totally with you there. Look at that. I had only 10 seconds left for this portion of the panel. 9, 8, 7. So now we're going to go to questions 6, 5, 4. Oh, wow. Okay, so there's somebody in the, where are the mics? Okay, great. So just like Jenny said, please identify yourself and your affiliation if you would, and ask a question. My version of David Elwood's is your voice should turn up at the end of the sentence, unless you're Richard or from a Commonwealth country, in which case it may go down a little bit at the end of the question. So let's start in the back there on the aisle, the gentleman in the jacket there.
Hi, thanks. My name's Lawrence. I'm a reporter. And these conversations keep circling back to how research should inform policy. And I'm really interested in policies that, as Pat Sharkey put it, break down the barricades. So I'm wondering if you can give us some examples of places and policies that have been forceful and effective in breaking down some of those barriers. And to the extent that they are forceful, I would ask you to speculate on the long-term political ramifications, because we're seeing some real flashpoints, especially as regards school segregation right now.
Who would like to start on that? That sounds like, it sounded like a Marge question. I'm sorry, but yeah. And then we can get others warmed up.
Well, I wish there was a great example of a forceful policy to break down the barriers of segregation that didn't generate opposition that makes it difficult to sustain. I wish there was. But so I think, we all have to just keep piling our efforts on top of each other and plugging away at this challenge. But I have sort of 3 examples I'd put out there. One is from King County, which, if I understand the policy correctly, has quite bravely gone out and purchased existing rental properties that already exist in high opportunity areas. And essentially counted on the fact that the market is so hot that those rents are going to become extremely affordable over time, being places that not only opportunity voucher holders can live, but other moderate and lower income households can live. So, and that's done very quietly because you're buying apartment buildings that exist already in a high opportunity location. So that's one. Everybody probably knows that Montgomery County has operated for a very long time inclusionary zoning program that goes beyond what most places do. It gives the housing authority the right to buy some of those units. So again, quietly, in a new development.
I really like that policy.
Yeah, it's a really cool policy. So you get moderate income families living in the below market units, but you also get some very low income families. And there's evidence there that the effects for children are profound. And then Minneapolis just got rid of its single family zoning. And a lot of places are talking about that. And it's freaking out a lot of people in many places that are talking about it. But it's interesting to me that typically when we talk about upzoning and going for higher density, the conversation is about going to a lot higher density. And just saying we're going to just no more single family, we could, again, this is another, we could begin like moving in the right direction.
I'll say too, for Charlotte, one of the things we're doing too is we have some very high valued assets in uptown Charlotte. And so what we're doing is really creating these mixed income, mixed use communities that are dense now. On our land, we can make inclusionary zoning a requirement, right? And so we're doing 80-20 deals now where 80% of the property is market rate, 20% is affordable, and making them just dynamic places to live. Kind of turning that area into what? A high opportunity area at the end of the day. So those are the type, I think if anybody can do those in their particular cities, I think that would be great.
Great, let's take another question. Where are the mics again? Let's get Solin. Hey, how you doing, Solin?
Solin Givergy, Senior Fellow at the Center for the Study of Social Policy. Marge, I just want to say real quickly, for the over a decade that I've known you, you always say structural racism. I wish you weren't always the only one who does it, but thank you for doing it. I was waiting for it. So
invented the term place-conscious policy.
There you
I
go.
want everybody to know. So yeah, just keep.
So my
keep saying that.
question for all of you is about social ties and social networks to sustain the mix. And so once the move is done, there are things we knew about MTO in terms of relationships in and among young people and such. And Sarah, in particular, because of the immigrant and refugee context of the Pacific Northwest, what are you finding either from the navigators around, are my people there? Will there be people to support me, the kind of cultural affinities and context, and how important that might be in the move?
Yeah, so I think it's something that we've thought about a lot, and in some ways, I kind of want to punt my answer on this until we have more data, right? So I think,
We'll have the next panel talk about that one, Sarah.
Yeah, exactly. Stick around. But I think we need to wait until we have more interviews that Stephanie and her team are working on with families around, what's their social network look like, and how much did it factor into their move decisions.
Anybody else on social networks? No? Okay. All right. A lot in the back row there, like very eager.
Thanks. I tried to ask a question on the last panel, so I'm still here and persistent. My name's Alex Static. I get to visit every once in a while with you all. My organization's called FAHI. We work in Appalachia, and so we're based in eastern Kentucky. And so I'm glad to be here with you all and appreciate all the work that the researchers on the first panel and these the fine practitioners here are doing on issues like structural racism and moving people to opportunity. I wanted to ask this is both for the panelists and for the Brookings staffers here, if you would care to answer, is the research focuses understandably on the larger cities because that's where the program, a pilot was. In a lot of parts of the country, we've got smaller cities and then towns where there are also, I'm holding a report that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. It's a discussion draft, but it points out that 80% of the persistent poverty counties are non-metro. They're small cities and rural, and that every majority Black and Native American county is also persistently poor. The majority of those in rural areas. And so I wonder, like in all of this discussion, I'm hoping that you all would elaborate a little bit on what you see as the opportunity for those places and how they can think about moving to opportunity given how the attachment to place they have. And also if you want to relate it to the political barriers that were talked about, because a lot of the legislators that make policy that may create housing vouchers, for example, and enough funds come from some of these more rural states. And that has an impact on policy. So, yeah, I really appreciate that. And for the Brookings folks, I'd love to hear what you think, because you're directing some of these kinds of panels, and would also extend an invite to a tour for anybody who would like to come to Appalachia. We would love to have you and show you how it works there as well outside of some of these larger cities. So, thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I can't speak exactly to the housing mobility strategies, and Marge is shaking me off. No, you do, okay, yeah.
I just want to say I feel really inadequate on this topic. And a couple of years ago, I tried to work with colleagues at Urban on this U.S. U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty that the Gates Foundation funded. We tried to develop a communities of opportunity strategy that would be applicable in rural communities as well as urban, and we realized the policy challenges aren't the same, the solutions aren't the same. We didn't know enough to be useful on the rural issues, and frankly, we didn't find the kind of rich body of scholarship and experimentation to build on. So
I guess my follow-up then just quickly is why do you think that is? Why is it that Brookings and why isn't that research coming up? I wonder.
I'll just, Richard will weigh in, but yeah, you're catching two think tank people on the panel who have long been associated with centers within their institutions that have the title metropolitan in their name. And so that's, in a way, Appalachia is sort of othered and has not gotten the kind of, I think, policy attention. And your organization was born out of the war on poverty and model cities and other kinds of very urban-focused programs in the late 1960s.
We've had a lot of conversations about it. We have scholars who would like to develop a rural program, and we haven't been able to get one off the ground. It may be that being called the Urban Institute makes it a little hard to get a rural program off the ground. But
Richard perhaps has one up his sleeve, so let's hear.
I just want to say that I did do a short paper where we just looked at the rural areas using the data from Opportunity Insights, which I'm happy to send to you, because most of the attention is with the cities, because that's where most of the people are, so it's reasonable in one way. And to try to look at, just in terms of correlations, what seemed to be the rural areas that showed high rates of upward mobility. And the slightly depressing finding was that they were all marked by pretty high levels of out-migration. Because, of course, what you're doing is you're seeing where the kids are from, but then you're measuring their adult earnings wherever they are, right? So you're not, the measure is what are your earnings in your mid-30s compared to where you grew up, but in your mid-30s you might be somewhere else. And actually those areas did show quite high levels of out-migration. So that was, in a way, quite a sobering finding, because what it suggested was, it was to go up, you had to go out for many of these areas. So I think all that does is underline the need for these place-conscious policies, because back to where we were before, it's not as if everybody wants to leave, and they should have the choice to be able to stay in those places and still have a decent quality of life.
Yeah, and so my final offering, Alex, is that some of the work that my program is doing, it's not about housing mobility per se, but rather how do we create more centers of opportunity across the country that are effectively urban in nature, let's say mid-sized cities, but aren't too far from places like Eastern Kentucky, right? Aren't too far from other parts of Appalachia, aren't too far from, very small towns in states like Michigan or South Carolina, rather than assume that the policy solution lies in building much more housing in Washington and San Francisco and Seattle and Boston, which of course we should do, but we cannot expect every young person, nor should we want every young person from those kinds of communities to have to go that far away from their families and their communities to seek opportunity. Let's come up here. Let's get the gentleman sitting here, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. Henry Watson. I'm a PhD student at Georgetown. The thing I wanted to ask about is we've established that a lot of these, all of these barriers are not just there by chance. They're intentionally erected to protect people from the disadvantaged areas. So when it comes to mobility programs, I'm curious about what the reaction is from the middle and upper income families that reside in the high opportunity areas. What's their reaction to mobility programs? And in places where there's fractured local government, like you were saying, is there a political conflict between the local governments that represents the high opportunity areas and the local governments that represents the low opportunity areas? Because obviously one might have more interest in a mobility program than another, strictly speaking from a rational protect my own perspective.
Well, you've heard of NIMBYism? not in my backyard. Same thing plays out. The great thing, though, about the voucher program, it is so stealth in a lot of ways that individuals don't really know who that individual is, that they have a Section 8, that they're having any subsidy or anything else. And so that's what makes this, I think, a program that can be scaled, you know, if we had more vouchers, that we could scale, because the issue is that you really can't tell. I do development as well. So when I'm doing a 150-unit apartment building and they know that since it's Fulton Meacham, he's going to have some affordable housing in it, I'm right in front of the zoning committee and city council, and I have little flags behind me saying, please vote no. And that influences the politics sometimes, and the inability to build more affordable housing. But when already in the marketplace you have vacancies, and now you can fill them this way, it's much more organic.
Yeah, I think we've been pretty stealth, as Fulton would say, but, you know, partly with CMTO, we wanted to make sure, and as you saw on that map, that we would see pretty diffuse distribution. So in terms of this impacting any particular receiving community a lot, there was no reason to be like sort of out in front. I think one thing, though, that has helped on the flip side of that in our work throughout the community, as Marge was saying, we've done a huge amount of work on development and acquisitions of units throughout the county. So 51% of the about 11,000 units that we own outright are in higher opportunity areas. And so we are already embedded in those communities. And one of the things that we're doing because of our MTW is working really closely with school districts throughout the county. And those are school districts in high and lower opportunity areas to make sure that we're figuring out how to bring those systems together. And I think that does help on some of the issues you're raising.
Okay, one last question. You want to go right here on the aisle?
Hi, my name is Rosa Lee from George Washington University. So for the Moving to Opportunity program is within the context of one region. And I'm just wondering whether it is possible even think about at the more federal level support and then moving to region, high opportunity region. This is might be related to the Alex at the back from rural to urban migration. But these days, if you wanted to move to across metropolitan area, that also there is a lot of structural barrier, especially housing, rent, prices. If you wanted to move from Charlotte to Seattle area, the rent difference is going to be $1,000, not necessarily a couple of $100s. So do you think finding a good opportunity region, opportunity moving to metro area is plausible, or is it worthwhile? Like, I just wanted to hear about what's your insight for this.
In principle, the voucher program is federal, so you can move out of the metropolitan area you received the voucher in. It's not easy. And a few families in the Moving to Opportunity demonstration did move beyond the boundaries of the metropolitan area. But I actually think the question about rural communities was about how can those communities become places of opportunity without requiring everybody to leave them.
Do either of you want to weigh in on that? You're thinking about it, Sarah? Yeah. So I guess the answer is it's possible. Whether it should be the emphasis of public policy or we should think that that's the solution that people are looking for, I guess is a separate question. So again, we'll come back to that on the next panel. But in the meanwhile, please join me in thanking our great panelists, Marge, Fulton, and Sarah. Back to Richard.
So I'm just going to close up. So
he won't take that long. Don't worry.
Because I do want to thank Alan and Jenny. I'm thrilled you mentioned Minneapolis. Jenny Schutz is leading a conference in Minneapolis with Abigail Wozniak on housing and mobility. I'm thrilled about that. Camille Bousset, my colleague here who runs the Race, Prosperity and Inclusion Initiative, is just embarking on a big project using qualitative research to look at social capital in Charlotte and how that relates to opportunity. I just want a couple of final thoughts. One is, it's thrilling to me how the big quantitative data revolution is driving qualitative research, because you reach the very limits of what you can do with quantitative data. You know, if even with all the data that they've got, Opportunity Insights, and as Nathan said, running all of these regressions, and we still have no idea what's going on in these neighborhoods, then there's no choice but to go to those neighborhoods and ask people who live in those neighborhoods what's going on in those neighborhoods. And so I think it's a great irony that the big data quantitative revolution will actually, I think, lead to a flourishing in qualitative. I love the point about evaluation that Marge made and others made, which is, we should have evidence-based policy making, but we shouldn't be so slavish about it, that we shouldn't be open to the fact that sometimes you might get surprising positives, that sometimes you didn't expect A to happen, but it did. And I think, you know, at worst, that leads to what I think of as policy-based evidence making, which is you retrospectively find evidence that something worked. But the fear of that shouldn't stop us from being open to the fact that even though that's what the policy was supposed to do, it actually did other things too, which didn't mean that it failed. Turns out a little extra help with a lot of extra choice can work. And the last point is to pick up something Stephanie said, which is, you mentioned something, residential pessimism, which I think is really nice. There's sometimes a bit of policy pessimism too, I think, because it turns out that it's really, really hard to move things. It's really, really hard to do things that work and that can be shown to work. And it's really, really hard to replicate those things to other places and then show that they work again. So actually to find that there are things that can be done, that there are interventions that with good evaluation can move the needle in a way that we feel good about, is actually an incredibly positive note to come out of this research. It doesn't mean that we don't have to continue to be rigorous, but it does mean that sometimes the woe is me, nothing can ever possibly work mood, I think, was nicely punctured, along with the idea that this is about people's preferences by the work that we've heard today. And I'm thrilled too that we not only did the research, but the practitioners, and just as the same way that quantitative people are collaborating qualitative people, the people who are doing the implementation, the work on the ground, and the people researching it, all of those collaborations are, I think, where the future is. So with that, thank you to all of you for staying the course, and for those who are watching online, watch this space.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.